There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a courtroom when a lie is exposed, a suffocating, terrifying vacuum of sound. Richard thought he knew that silence. He thought he commanded it. For 2 years he had gaslit, drained, and publicly humiliated his wife Simone, leaving her a hollow shell of the vibrant, formidable black woman she once was. Or so he believed. He didn't know that every tear she shed was a calculated investment, and her breakdown was the perfect cover for a masterclass in vengeance. This is the story of how a shattered woman bought the gavel that broke her husband. Room 1905 of the Cook County Circuit Court in downtown Chicago smelled faintly of floor wax, aged paper, and quiet desperation. Outside the heavy oak doors, the relentless winds of late November battered the city, but inside, the atmosphere was stiflingly still. Simone Hayes sat at the plaintiff's table, perfectly still, her posture a masterpiece of manufactured defeat. She wore a tailored but understated charcoal gray suit that seemed to swallow her frame, making her look smaller than her 5'9" stature. Her rich dark skin lacked its usual radiant warmth, carefully muted by a deliberate lack of makeup, and her thick natural hair was pulled back into a severe, unforgiving bun. To anyone looking, in the gallery was comfortably seated with Richard's wealthy friends and business associates. Simone was a broken woman. Her shoulders were rounded, her eyes fixed firmly on the scarred mahogany table in front of her. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling just enough to be noticeable. Across the aisle at the defense table sat her husband. Richard Hayes was a man who looked like he had been born in a bespoke suit. Today he wore a $4,000 Navy Tom Ford two-piece, his silver fox hair perfectly styled, his jawline sharp, and his posture practically radiating triumph. He leaned back in his chair, whispering something to his high-powered attorney, Gregory Pierce, before letting out a soft, confident chuckle. Richard didn't just want a divorce, he wanted an annihilation. The presiding judge, the Honorable Patricia Rawlings, adjusted her glasses and peered down from the bench. She was a no-nonsense woman with 30 years of family law under her belt, and even she cast a look of subtle pity toward Simone. The battle over the Hayes estate was supposed to be the easiest kill of Richard's life. 7 years ago, when Richard's tech logistics firm Synergy Freight was nothing more than a failing pitch deck, it was Simone who had funded him. Simone, a brilliant data architect, had quietly liquidated her own stock portfolio and handed him $400,000 to keep his dream alive. But as the company exploded into a $60 million enterprise, Richard's gratitude had slowly curdled into resentment. He didn't like the narrative that his brilliant black wife was the architect of his success. He preferred the myth of the self-made man, so he began to dismantle her. It didn't start with physical violence or explosive arguments. It started with subtle psychological warfare. He began moving money out of their joint accounts, claiming it was tied up in necessary venture capital liquidity. When Simone questioned the discrepancies, he would stare at her with feigned concern. "You're confusing the personal and corporate ledgers again, Simone. You've been so forgetful lately. Are you sleeping enough?" Then came the mistress, Jessica Trent, a 25-year-old PR executive for his firm. Richard didn't just sleep with Jessica. He bought her a penthouse condo in the Gold Coast, using funds systematically siphoned from a real estate trust Simone had inherited from her late father. When Simone found a receipt for a diamond necklace she never received, Richard turned it back on her. He hid her car keys. He changed the security codes on their smart home while she was out, leaving her locked in the freezing Chicago winter. When she finally broke down screaming at him in their driveway, he recorded it on his phone and played it for their mutual friends, shaking his head with sorrow. "She's losing her mind. It's early onset paranoia. I don't know how much longer I can protect her from herself." He wanted her to believe she was crazy. And for a brief, terrifying month, Simone almost did. But then she found the hidden flash drive in his golf bag, containing the offshore routing numbers to a shell company named Aegis Holdings. Instead of confronting him, Simone made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She decided to give Richard exactly what he wanted, a crazy, broken, helpless wife. She stopped asking questions. She cried at dinner parties. She let him guide her by the elbow like an invalid. She let him file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences exacerbated by severe emotional instability. And now here they were. "Counsel, are we ready to proceed with the financial disclosures?" Judge Rawlings asked, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. Gregory Pierce stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense is prepared to demonstrate that the prenuptial agreement, signed by both parties in 2019, is fully enforceable. Furthermore, we will show that Mrs. Hayes' erratic financial behavior over the past 18 months requires my client to retain full control of Synergy Freight and all associated liquid assets." Next to Simone sat her lawyer, Leonard Wallace. Leonard was 62, wore a slightly rumpled tan suit, and had a reputation for settling out of court because he lacked the teeth for trial litigation. Richard had practically chosen Leonard for her, subtly guiding her toward the cheapest, most passive lawyer in the city during her fragile state. Leonard stood up slowly, clearing his throat. "Ready, Your Honor," he mumbled, adjusting his tie. Richard caught Simone's eye across the room and offered a sad, patronizing smile. Simone immediately looked down, her lower lip trembling. "Perfect," she thought. "Keep smiling, Richard. The higher you climb, the longer the fall." "The defense calls Richard Hayes to the stand," Gregory Pierce announced, his voice booming with theatrical authority. Richard stood, adjusting his cuffs, and walked toward the witness box with the practiced stride of a CEO entering a boardroom. He swore to tell the truth with a solemn, earnest expression that had charmed investors from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. As Richard settled into the wooden chair, Pierce approached the podium. "Mr. Hayes, let's talk about the last 2 years of your marriage. It has been a difficult time, hasn't it?" "Incredibly difficult," Richard sighed, looking at the judge with a heavy, sorrowful gaze. "I love my wife. I always will. But somewhere along the line, the pressure of our lifestyle, it broke her. She stopped coming to work. She began hallucinating financial discrepancies. I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on private therapy for her, but she refused to attend." "And her spending?" Pierce prompted. Richard shook his head tragically. "Erratic. Thousands of dollars withdrawn in cash, unaccounted for. I had to step in and freeze our primary accounts to protect our livelihood and the jobs of the 300 employees who depend on Synergy Freight." In the gallery, a few of Richard's associates murmured in sympathetic agreement. "And regarding the company's current valuation?" Pierce asked, pulling up a document on the courtroom monitors. "You've provided audited statements showing a severe downturn in the logistics market, valuing the company's liquid assets at a mere $4 million, correct?" "That is correct," Richard lied flawlessly. "We barely survived the last fiscal quarter. That is why enforcing the prenuptial agreement, which allocates the primary residence and a modest stipend to Simone while leaving the company in my hands, is the only way to avoid total bankruptcy." Pierce turned to the judge. "Your Honor, my client is simply trying to salvage what is left of a tragic situation. We have nothing further on direct, Mr. Parth." "Wallace?" Judge Rawlings prompted, looking at Simone's rumpled attorney. "Your witness." Leonard Wallace stood up, almost knocking over a stack of yellow legal pads. He fumbled with his reading glasses, dropping a pen in the process. Richard smirked openly now. This was going to be a slaughter. "Mr. Hayes," Leonard began, his voice lacking any real volume. "You claim the business is struggling. The numbers speak for themselves, Mr. Cree." "Wallace," Richard replied smoothly. Right. The numbers." Leonard shuffled a paper, squinting at it. "You took a business trip to the Cayman Islands in October of 2024. Was that to secure new shipping routes?" "Yes," Richard answered, slightly annoyed by the trivial question. "Our Caribbean logistics expansion. It ultimately failed, further draining our resources." "Ah, a shame," Leonard muttered, pacing awkwardly toward the center of the room. "And while you were there, did you happen to visit a branch of the Meridian Trust Bank?" Richard's smirk froze. It was a microscopic shift, a tightening of the muscles around his jaw, but Simone, watching from under her lashes, saw it. "I may have used an ATM," Richard said casually. "I don't recall every errand on a business trip." "Of course not," Leonard agreed amiably. He picked up another piece of paper. "I have a subpoenaed ledger here from Meridian Trust. It shows an account opened under the name Aegis Holdings, LLC. Objection. Gregory Pierce was on his feet instantly. Relevance, Your Honor. The defense has already submitted all corporate holdings related to Synergy Freight. Mr. Wallace, where are you going with this? Judge Rawlings asked, narrowing her eyes. Just establishing a timeline of Mr. Hayes's travel, Your Honor, Leonard said meekly. Sustained. Move it along, Counselor, the judge ordered. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders. He shot a glare at Leonard, who quickly looked away, seemingly intimidated. Richard relaxed again. The old fool had just stumbled onto a random name. He didn't actually have anything. Aegis Holdings was buried beneath 3 layers of blind trusts in Delaware before the money even touched the Caymans. There was no way Simone or this discount lawyer could breach that corporate veil. My apologies, Leonard stuttered. Let's talk about the Gold Coast property. The penthouse on Astor Street. You purchased this under a corporate subsidiary. No. Tie. It was intended as corporate housing for visiting executives, Richard stated firmly. Corporate housing, Leonard repeated, for visiting executives, such as Jessica Trent. Pierce stood up again. Objection. Your Honor, Illinois is a no-fault divorce state. Infidelity is entirely irrelevant to the division of assets or the enforcement of the prenup. True, Mr. Pierce, Judge Rawlings agreed. Mr. Wallace, you know better than this. The court doesn't care who your client's husband was sleeping with unless it directly impacts the marital estate. I withdraw the question, Leonard said, retreating to his table. He looked down at Simone. I think that's all I have for now, Your Honor. A collective sigh of relief and amusement washed over Richard's side of the courtroom. Pierce patted Richard on the back as he stepped down from the witness box. It was over. The cross-examination was a pathetic display. Richard had successfully painted himself as the victim, legally insulated his stolen fortune, and was poised to walk away with 90% of their net worth. Judge Rawlings looked at her watch. Very well. Let's take a 1-hour recess for lunch. When we return, the plaintiff may call their first witness. All rise, the bailiff shouted. As the courtroom emptied, Richard walked past Simone's table. He paused, leaning down so only she could hear him over the rustling of papers and closing briefcases. You should have just taken the settlement, Simmy, he whispered, using his old pet name for her, his breath smelling of expensive espresso and mint. Look at you. You're a mess. I'm doing you a favor by ending this quickly. Simone didn't shrink away this time. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head. The manufactured tremor in her hands vanished. A spine straightened, transforming her posture from a broken victim to a coiled viper. For the first time in 18 months, she looked Richard directly in the eyes with absolute, freezing clarity. Enjoy your lunch, Richard, Simone said, her voice completely steady, dropping an octave into a smooth, commanding register he hadn't heard since the day she handed him that $400,000 check. Because it's the last meal you're ever going to eat as a free man. Richard froze. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced his chest. He stared at her, trying to find the fragile, hallucinating woman he had spent 2 years breaking. But she wasn't there. Looking back at him was the brilliant data architect who built algorithms that could track a single penny across a global financial grid. Simone offered him a slow, chilling smile, picked up her simple leather folder, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Richard standing in the aisle with a sudden, suffocating feeling that the trap had just snapped shut. The 1-hour lunch recess felt like a suspended breath in the halls of the Cook County Circuit Court. When the heavy oak doors finally swung open and the gallery refilled, the atmosphere had shifted. The smug, relaxed energy radiating from Richard's side of the aisle had evaporated, replaced by a tense, vibrating uncertainty. Richard sat stiffly next to Gregory Pierce, his eyes darting toward the plaintiff's table. Simone was already seated. The oversized charcoal gray blazer she had worn all morning was draped over the back of her chair. She now wore a crisp, fitted white silk blouse, the sharp collar framing her neck like armor. She sat with perfect, terrifying posture. Judge Patricia Rawlings took the bench, the sharp crack of her gavel echoing like a gunshot. Court is back in session, Mr. Wallace. You may call your first witness. Leonard Wallace stood up. But something was entirely different. The stooped, fungling, absent-minded older man from the morning session was gone. He didn't drop his pen. He didn't adjust his glasses. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, buttoning his suit jacket with the crisp, practiced efficiency of a seasoned litigator. "Thank you, Your Honor." Leonard's voice resonated through the room, suddenly possessing a deep, commanding baritone that made Gregory Pierce physically flinch. The plaintiff calls Simone Hayes to the stand. Simone stood, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. She took the oath, her voice clear, resonant, and entirely devoid of the trembling fragility she had feigned for the past 2 years. She sat down, crossing her legs, and leveled a gaze at Leonard that was purely business. "Mrs. Hayes," Leonard began, pacing slowly before the jury box. "Let us clarify a few details for the court. Could you please state your full professional title and your educational background?" "I am a senior forensic data architect," Simone answered smoothly. "I hold a master's in applied cryptography from MIT and a Ph.D. in data science from Stanford University. Prior to my marriage, I spent 6 years building anti-money laundering algorithms for the Federal Reserve." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard Glanch. He had always downplayed her resume, telling his friends she was just in IT. "Impressive," Leonard noted. "And what was your role in the founding of Synergy Freight?" "In 2017, I provided the initial $400,000 in seed capital to establish the company," Simone stated, her eyes flicking to Richard for a fraction of a second. "More importantly, I designed and coded the proprietary logistics tracking software, known internally as Project Leviathan. It is the core operating system that Synergy Freight relies upon to track global shipments, manage fleet fuel efficiency, and process international vendor payments." "So, you didn't just fund the company, Mrs. Hayes. You built the brain it operates on." "Objection!" Pierce barked, standing up, leading the witness. "Furthermore, Mrs. Hayes surrendered her voting shares and operational title 2 years ago due to health reasons." "Overruled," Judge Rawlings said, leaning forward, her eyes locked on Simone. "I'll allow it. The witness may answer." "I built the system, yes," Simone confirmed. "And when you stepped down from your operational role 18 months ago, did you lose access to this system?" Leonard asked. Simone offered a small, razor-sharp smile. "Mr. Hayes believed I did. He systematically revoked my administrative privileges, locked me out of the corporate VPN, and had the IT department wipe my company credentials." "But," Leonard prompted. "But you cannot lock the architect out of her own house," Simone said, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I wrote the source code, Mr. Wallace. I built an encrypted read-only backdoor into the Leviathan mainframe long before Synergy Freight Incorporated. It was designed as a failsafe against corporate espionage. Every data packet, every internal email, and every fractional financial transfer executed by Synergy Freight has been passively mirrored to a secure server I maintain." The color rapidly drained from Richard's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to notice him. He leaned over, grabbing Pierce's arm, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric. "She's lying," he hissed frantically. "She can't do that. That's illegal." "Mr. Hayes," Judge Rawlings snapped, glaring over her glasses. "Control yourself, or I will have you removed." Leonard walked back to his table and picked up a thick, leather-bound binder. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. He handed a copy to the bailiff to pass to the judge, and another to a visibly paling Gregory Pierce. "Your Honor, I am entering Plaintiff's Exhibit A into evidence," Leonard announced. "This is a comprehensive, time-stamped digital forensic audit of Synergy Freight's shadow ledgers, spanning from January 2023 to present." Pierce flipped open the binder, his eyes scanning the first page. His breath hitched. "Mrs. Hayes," Leonard continued, "could you explain to the court what a shadow ledger is and what you found when you audited your husband's company?" "Gladly," Simone said, adjusting her microphone. "A shadow ledger is a secondary off-the-books accounting system used to conceal financial transactions. While my husband was presenting audited statements showing a $4 million valuation and severe market losses, he was simultaneously executing fractional diversions. Every time Synergy Freight billed a client, The Leviathan software was manually overwritten to siphon exactly 8.5% of the gross profit. And where did this 8.5% go, Mrs. Hayes? It was routed through an intermediary payment processor in Delaware, then wire transferred to an offshore entity under the name Aegis Holdings LLC, registered at the Meridian Trust Bank in the Cayman Islands. Simone paused, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing. The current liquid balance of Aegis Holdings is $22,460,000. And the courtroom erupted. Order! Order in my courtroom. Judge Rawlings hammered her gavel furiously, the sharp clack-clack cutting through the chaotic murmurs of the gallery. She pointed the wooden mallet directly at Richard's table. Mr. Pierce, if you cannot control your client, he will be held in contempt. Richard was half out of his chair, his perfectly styled hair now slightly disheveled, his face flushed a dangerous mottled red. She hacked my company, Your Honor. This is inadmissible. It's corporate espionage, he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Sit down, Richard, Pierce hissed, violently yanking his client back into his seat by the jacket lapel. The high-powered attorney looked nauseous. He was a ruthless lawyer, but he wasn't stupid. He had built his defense on the financial disclosures Richard had sworn were accurate. If Richard had lied about $22 million, Pierce was currently standing in the blast radius of massive perjury. Judge Rawlings turned her furious gaze toward the defense table. Mr. Pierce, did you or did you not submit sworn financial affidavits stating your client's net worth was tied entirely to a struggling $4 million asset? Your Honor, I submitted the documents provided to me by my client and his chief financial officer, Pierce stammered, frantically trying to build a legal firewall between himself and Richard. If these allegations are true, the defense was completely unaware. They are true, Your Honor, Leonard Wallace interjected smoothly. He walked over to the jury box rail, leaning against it with casual confidence. And the plaintiff is prepared to prove that not only did Mr. Hayes commit perjury in this courtroom today, but he's been actively engaged in marital asset dissipation, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Objection! Pierce yelled out of pure reflex, though his voice lacked its previous boom. Your Honor, this is a family court. We are here to enforce a prenuptial agreement, not conduct a federal fraud trial. The provenance of these so-called documents is highly questionable. Leonard smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile. The defense might have noticed, if they had bothered to read the supplemental discovery motions I filed at 11:45 p.m. last night, that all of Mrs. Hayes' data was independently verified. Leonard turned to Simone. Mrs. Hayes, did you rely solely on your own proprietary backdoor to gather this evidence? I did not, Simone answered calmly, because I anticipated Mr. Hayes would accuse me of tampering or illegal hacking. So, 3 months ago, acting in my legal capacity as a 50% shareholder of the marital estate, I submitted a whistleblower information report Form 211 to the Internal Revenue Service. Richard stopped breathing. The courtroom went dead silent. I provided the IRS Criminal Investigation Division with the routing numbers, the IP addresses of the manual overrides, and the encrypted keys to the shadow ledgers, Simone continued, her voice echoing in the stillness. They secured a federal warrant under the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA. The documents in Exhibit A are not my personal printouts. They are subpoenaed federal bank records, stamped and authenticated by the Department of the Treasury. Judge Rawlings slowly took off her glasses. She looked at Richard Hayes as if she were looking at a cockroach on a sterile surgical table. Mr. Pierce, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Is your client aware of the penalties for lying under oath in my courtroom while simultaneously attempting to defraud his wife of $20 million? Your Honor, my client. Pierce stopped. He looked at the federal stamp on the documents in front of him. He closed the binder. My client invokes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, Your Honor, and I am formally requesting a recess to confer with my client, as I may need to withdraw as his counsel. Denied, Judge Rawlings snapped. We are finishing this testimony. Mr. Wallace, proceed. Thank you, Your Honor. Leonard flipped a page on his legal pad. Mrs. Hayes, let's discuss the Gold Coast penthouse. Mr. Hayes testified under oath today that the property on Astor Street was corporate housing. Is that what your audit revealed? Simon's eyes finally locked onto Richard's. 2 years of being called crazy. 2 years of crying in empty rooms, pretending to be broken while he paraded his mistress around Chicago. 2 years of playing the victim so the predator would get sloppy. No, Simone said, her voice dripping with ice. The property was purchased by a subsidiary shell company called Apex Vanguard. I tracked the incorporation documents for Apex Vanguard. The sole listed director and primary beneficiary is not Synergy Freight. It is Jessica Trent. In the gallery, a young woman in a designer trench coat suddenly stood up, looking terrified. Several heads turned toward her. It was Jessica. She took one look at Simone on the stand, turned on her heel, and practically ran out of the courtroom doors. Furthermore, Simone pressed on, not missing a beat, the funds used to purchase that $2.6 million penthouse were not diverted from corporate revenue. They were drawn directly from a joint real estate trust established by my late father. Richard forged my digital signature to liquidate my family's inheritance to buy a home for his mistress. Richard put his head in his hands. He was trembling. The facade of the untouchable CEO was completely shattered. He wasn't just losing the divorce, he was losing his company, his freedom, and his entire life. Mrs. Hayes, Leonard asked, stepping back to let the magnitude of the moment breathe. Given this systematic financial abuse, gaslighting, and fraud, what is it that you are asking the court for today? Simone looked directly at Judge Rawlings. Your Honor, Simone said clearly, the prenuptial agreement states that in the event of gross financial misconduct or felony conviction by either party, the agreement is nullified, and the injured party is entitled to 100% of the marital assets and corporate voting shares. Simone paused, letting her gaze drift down to where Richard sat, thoroughly and utterly destroyed. I don't just want a divorce, Your Honor, Simone concluded, her tone echoing the final heavy toll of a bell. I want my company back. The silence that followed Simone's demand did not feel empty. It felt like the crushing pressure at the bottom of the ocean. The air in room 1905 of the Cook County Circuit Court grew thick, suffocating every ounce of arrogance out of Richard Hayes's lungs. He stared at the woman he had spent 2 years gaslighting, realizing with a sickening jolt that she had never been trapped in his maze. She had been the one designing the walls. Gregory Pierce, a man whose hourly billing rate could fund the small municipality, stood up slowly. His face was the color of wet ash. As a veteran of high-stakes corporate divorce, Pierce knew exactly what a federal authentication stamp from the Department of the Treasury meant. It meant the game was over, and the blast radius was expanding. Your Honor, Pierce said, his voice stripped of all its previous theatrical bravado. In light of the evidence presented, evidence that was fundamentally withheld from myself and my firm, by my client, I find myself in a legally and ethically untenable position. I must formally motion to withdraw as counsel for Mr. Hayes, effective immediately. Richard whipped his head around, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated panic. Greg, you can't do that. You work for me. I pay you a retainer of You pay me to represent you within the bounds of the law, Richard, Pierce snapped, dropping all formalities, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper. You lied to me. You lied to the court. And you handed me falsified financial affidavits to submit to a judge. You have made me an unwitting accomplice to federal perjury. Do not speak to me again unless it is through a defense attorney specializing in white-collar crime. Pierce turned back to the bench. Your Honor, I humbly request permission to withdraw. Oh, Judge Rawlings stared down at the unraveling scene with a mixture of disgust and grim satisfaction. Motion granted, Mr. Pierce. You are excused from this table, though I suggest you retain your own counsel regarding those affidavits. Pierce didn't hesitate. He grabbed his Italian leather briefcase, shoved his laptop inside, and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom without a backward glance. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, sounding like the closing of a coffin lid. Richard was left sitting entirely alone at the expansive defense table. The visual was striking, the tailored 6'2" CEO, stripped of his expensive attack dog, looking incredibly small and utterly terrified. Mr. Pa, Hayes, Judge Rawlings addressed him, her voice cutting through the quiet like a serrated blade. You are currently without representation. You have the right to request a continuance to secure new counsel. However, given the extreme and thoroughly documented nature of the fraud presented by the plaintiff, I'm not inclined to let you walk out of this building with access to a single penny of the disputed assets. Richard stood up, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table to steady himself. His perfectly styled silver fox hair had fallen over his forehead. Your Honor, please, this is a misunderstanding. A gross mischaracterization of corporate tax strategy. Simone, me wife, she doesn't understand the complexities of international logistics financing. Oh. Simone let out a soft, dark laugh. The sound made Richard flinch. I wrote the code that calculates the compound interest of your offshore shell companies down to the microsecond, Richard, Simone said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. I understand the math perfectly. You stole $22,460,000. You diverted it through Delaware, washed it through the Caymans, and used it to buy real estate for a 25-year-old PR assistant. There is no tax strategy in forgery. Simmy, please, Richard begged, abandoning the judge and turning directly to his wife. His voice cracked, tears welling in his eyes, real tears this time, born of absolute terror. Please, 2 years ago you were struggling. You know you were. I was just trying to protect the company. Protect us. I was struggling, Simone agreed, her eyes turning to chips of black ice. Because my husband was slowly poisoning my reality. You hid my keys. You gaslit me about our bank accounts. You locked me out of our home in the dead of winter. You recorded me crying and played it for our friends like a tragedy you had to endure. You tried to make me believe I was losing my mind, Richard. Do you know what kind of discipline it takes to sit at a dinner table, let a man you once loved treat you like an invalid, and smile, knowing you hold the keys to his destruction? She leaned forward, her presence dominating the room. I didn't break. I adapted. I let you believe you had won, so you would get sloppy. And you did. Leonard Wallace, standing off to the side, cleared his throat, sensing the kill. Your Honor, the plaintiff formally files an emergency ex parte motion for a temporary restraining order on all financial accounts associated with Richard Hayes, Synergy Freight, and Aegis Holdings. We also request an immediate freeze on the Astor Street property. Granted, Judge Rawlings fired back without a second of hesitation. She picked up her pen, furiously signing the orders Leonard had brought to the bench. I am freezing every asset you have, Mr. Hayes. Furthermore, I am invalidating the prenuptial agreement on the grounds of egregious financial fraud and marital asset dissipation. Richard's knees buckled. He collapsed back into his chair, his breath coming in short, hyperventilating gasps. But we are not finished, Judge Rawlings continued, her gavel poised. The evidence presented today regarding tax evasion and wire fraud goes far beyond the jurisdiction of family court. I am ordering the court clerk to forward the unredacted transcripts of today's proceedings, along with Plaintiff's Exhibit A, directly to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois. She banged her gavel. The sound was deafening. This court is adjourned. Mr. Hayes, I highly recommend you do not attempt to leave the state. 72 hours later, the relentless, biting Chicago wind howled through the steel and glass canyons of the Fulton Market District, mirroring the absolute turbulence inside the towering headquarters of Synergy Freight. The atmosphere within the corporate offices was one of pure, unadulterated chaos. Rumors of the disastrous court hearing had bled through the company grapevine with the terrifying, unstoppable speed of a digital virus. Lower-level employees huddled in break rooms speaking in hushed, panicked tones about frozen accounts and federal warrants. The legal department on the 38th floor was in a state of high alert paralysis, frantically shredding non-essential documents while dodging calls from aggressive business reporters. Perhaps most tellingly, Jessica Trent's expansive, glass-walled corner office had been mysteriously and thoroughly cleared out in the dead of the night, leaving behind nothing but a faint scent of expensive perfume and an empty mahogany desk. In the penthouse boardroom on the 40th floor, Richard Hayes was a cornered animal. The man who had cultivated an image of unshakable Silicon Valley stoicism was unraveling in real time. He stood at the head of the massive 20-foot obsidian conference table, sweating through his custom powder blue dress shirt. His usually immaculate silver fox hair was sticking up at odd angles, his tie was ripped halfway down his chest, and his eyes were wild with exhaustion and terror. He was desperately trying to pacify his board of directors, but the room felt like a powder keg with a lit fuse. "The assets are temporarily frozen, yes, but it is a clerical misunderstanding," Richard shouted, slamming his open palm against the heavy obsidian table, the smack echoing sharply. "I am currently negotiating with the SEC and the family court judges. We have the underlying capital to weather this storm. I just need the board to authorize an emergency, short-term line of credit so we can meet Friday's payroll and keep the fleet moving." "Are you completely out of your mind, Richard?" snapped David Caldwell. Caldwell, the oldest board member and the lead venture capitalist who had backed the company in its infancy, stood up, his face flushed with righteous fury. "The banks aren't touching us. Hell, they won't even return my phone calls. Your wife filed a FATCA warrant with the Department of the Treasury. The feds are inside the house, Richard. You've been siphoning gross corporate profits into a private Cayman account for 2 years. You didn't just steal from your wife. You stole from this board. You stole from our shareholders. And you committed federal fraud under our banner. I built this company from the ground up," Richard roared, his voice cracking violently, the veins bulging dangerously against his neck. "I am the CEO. I control the 51% majority voting shares. You work at my discretion. You will authorize the emergency credit line right now, or so help me God, I will dissolve this entire board before lunch." The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. "Actually, Richard," a smooth, melodious, and terrifyingly commanding voice echoed through the tense room. "You don't control anything at all." Every head in the room, including Richard's, snapped toward the entrance. Simone Hayes walked in. She was no longer wearing the oversized, drab, depressive clothing she had hidden beneath for the last 2 years. She was dressed for war, and she looked magnificent. She wore a sharp, immaculate, tailored ivory pantsuit by Alexander McQueen that radiated power. On her feet were a pair of blood-red Christian Louboutin stilettos that clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, sounding like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Her thick, natural hair was styled upward in a towering, unapologetic crown of curls, and her makeup was flawless, highlighting the sharp, predatory intelligence in her dark eyes. She looked exactly like what she was, a queen stepping back into her stolen kingdom to reclaim her throne. Flanking her were 3 imposing figures: Leonard Wallace, attorney who was carrying a thick leather briefcase and wearing an incredibly smug smile, a massive uniformed private security contractor, and a grim-faced man in a cheap, off-the-rack gray suit, flashing a heavy gold and blue FBI badge, clipped to his leather belt. Richard stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his expensive leather chair, knocking it over with a loud crash. "What are you doing here? You can't be in this building." "Security. Get her out of this building immediately." Oh, but building security works for the primary shareholder, Richard," Simone said smoothly, gliding past him without so much as a flinch. She tossed a thick, aggressively stamped legal binder onto the dead center of the obsidian table. She didn't look at her trembling husband. Instead, she directed her piercing gaze to David Caldwell and the rest of the stunned board of directors. "Gentlemen," Simone began, her voice possessing a calm, undeniable authority that instantly silenced the room. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, Judge Patricia Rawlings signed the final emergency legal decree. Due to gross documented criminal misconduct, marital asset dissipation, and perjury, the prenuptial agreement was voided in its entirety. I have been awarded 100% of the marital assets. That includes, effective immediately, the 51% of Synergy Freight voting shares previously held by my soon-to-be ex-husband." She walked slowly around the perimeter of the table, her red soles flashing, claiming the space as her own. "Furthermore," Simone continued, holding up a sleek tablet, "I am aware of the payroll crisis. I have already bypassed the frozen corporate accounts using my original administrative backdoor, the core code of which, I might remind you, I built from scratch. Friday's payroll for all 300 employees has been successfully met, fully funded by my own private capital. The company is secure. The logistics fleet is moving. The cancer, however, is currently being excised. David Caldwell let out a long, shuddering breath, looking from the heavily stamped federal legal documents to Simone's calm face. The sheer competence radiating from her was a shock to his system. Simone, Mrs. Hayes, I swear to you we had absolutely no idea about the shadow ledgers or the Cayman accounts. I know you didn't, David, because Richard is a very convincing sociopathic liar, Simone said softly, finally turning her dark, unforgiving gaze to her husband. But the lying officially stops today. The grim-faced man with the badge stepped forward, instantly shifting the energy in the room from corporate hostile takeover to a criminal takedown. 2 more federal agents materialized from the hallway, stepping quietly into the boardroom. Richard Hayes, the lead agent said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. I'm Special Agent Miller with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. We have a federal warrant for your arrest on multiple felony charges including wire fraud, tax evasion, and severe violations of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. No, Richard gasped, all the blood draining from his face as the sheer, inescapable reality of the moment finally broke his mind. No. Wait. Please wait. Let me call my lawyer. Your lawyer quit, Richard, Agent Miller stated flatly, stepping forward and grabbing Richard by the bicep. With practiced, forceful efficiency, Miller spun the former CEO around. The loud metallic snick-snick of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed off the glass walls of the silent boardroom. For Simone it was the sweetest symphony she had ever heard. As the cold steel clamped tightly around his wrists, Richard's legs completely gave out beneath him. The man who had terrorized his wife, who had paraded his stolen wealth and his young mistress across the city of Chicago, who had genuinely believed himself to be an untouchable god among men. Completely shattered, he dropped heavily to his knees right there on the imported, hand-woven wool carpet. He looked up at Simone, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pathetic, desperate agony, hot tears streaming down his cheeks. "Simmy, please," Richard sobbed loudly, his voice raw and broken, echoing pitifully in the glass room as the board members watched in stunned, uncomfortable silence. "Please, I'll give you everything back. I'll sign whatever documents you want. Just call them off. Don't let them put me in federal prison. I won't survive it in there. Please, God, I'm begging you." Simone stood directly over him, looking down at the weeping, ruined man kneeling at her feet. She felt no pity. She felt no lingering affection. She felt no sorrow for the ghost of the marriage they once had. She felt only the cold, perfect, undeniable mathematics of justice. She leaned down slightly, her face inches from his, her voice a lethal, perfectly controlled whisper meant only for him to hear. "You spent 2 years telling everyone in the city that I was broken, Richard," she said softly, her eyes locking onto his terrified ones. "But you forgot one fundamental rule of engineering." Simone straightened her posture, looking down at him with eyes that flashed with absolute triumphant victory. "Broken glass cuts the deepest. Take him out of my building." The interrogation room at the FBI's Chicago field office on Roosevelt Road was aggressively sterile. It smelled of bleached linoleum, stale coffee, and the distinct sour sweat of ruined men. Richard Hayes sat slumped at the bolted-down aluminum table, the stainless steel handcuffs biting into his wrists. His $4,000 Tom Ford suit was severely wrinkled, and the charismatic aura that had defined his entire adult life was completely gone. The heavy metal door clicked open. Federal Prosecutor William Gable, a veteran attorney with a reputation for prosecuting white-collar criminals with merciless efficiency, walked in. He was followed by Special Agent Miller. Gable didn't sit down. He simply tossed a thick manila folder onto the center of the table. The loud smack made Richard flinch. "I want my phone," Richard demanded, his voice a hoarse, desperate croak. "I need to call Jessica Trend. She has the secondary passwords to the Delaware accounts." She can authorize the transfer to pay for my defense." Gable exchanged a dry, humorless look with Agent Miller. The prosecutor leaned over the table, resting his knuckles on the cold metal. "Mr. Hayes, you really haven't grasped the architecture of the trap you're sitting in, have you?" Gable asked quietly. He opened the folder and slid a single photograph across the table. It was a surveillance photo taken at a downtown coffee shop. In the photo, Simone Hayes was sitting across a small table from Jessica Trent. Richard stared at the image, his brain short-circuiting. "What is this? When was this?" "6 months ago," Agent Miller answered, pulling up a chair and sitting backward on it. "Your wife didn't just audit your shadow ledgers, Richard. She analyzed your legal vulnerabilities. When she realized you put the Apex Vanguard shell company entirely in Miss Trent's name to insulate yourself, she paid Miss Trent a visit." Gable tapped the photo. "Mrs. Hayes sat down with your mistress and showed her the math. She explained very clearly that when the IRS eventually cracked the offshore accounts, you had perfectly positioned Jessica to take the fall for a $22 million tax evasion scheme. A federal judge would have given her 20 years minimum." Richard's blood ran cold. "No!" "Yes," Gable corrected. Faced with 2 decades in a federal penitentiary for a man who was using her as a legal meat shield, Miss Trent made the intelligent choice. She became confidential informant 409 for the Department of the Treasury. She's been wearing a wire in your bed for 5 months, Richard. She handed over the incorporation documents, the server passwords, and the forged signatures. That's why she ran out of the courtroom today. Her handler texted her to evacuate the building because the hammer was coming down. The last pillar of Richard's reality crumbled into dust. He wasn't just outsmarted. He had been systematically dismantled by the 2 women he thought he was controlling. Simone hadn't just survived his psychological warfare. She had weaponized his own arrogance against him. He put his face in his manacled hands and finally, genuinely wept. 8 months later, the relentless Chicago winter had thawed into a brilliant, golden spring. Inside the executive suite of Synergy Freight, the atmosphere was unrecognizable from the toxic, fear-driven culture Richard had fostered. The heavy mahogany furniture had been cleared out, replaced by sleek, modern, open-concept designs. Simone Hayes stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. She wore a stunning emerald green tailored suit that perfectly complemented her rich, dark skin. Her natural hair was worn in a magnificent, unbothered halo. She was no longer the shrinking, exhausted woman in oversized gray blazers. She was the undisputed sovereign of a $60 million empire. Her first act as the legal CEO had been a corporate bloodletting. She fired the chief financial officer, Peter Sterling, and 3 other board members who had turned a blind eye to Richard's creative accounting. She replaced them with a diverse, aggressive team of data analysts and logistics experts. Under her direct leadership, and utilizing a fully optimized version of the Project Leviathan software she had coded, the company's profit margins hadn't just stabilized, they had skyrocketed by 32% in 2 quarters. Her intercom buzzed. It was her new executive assistant, a sharp young woman named Chloe. "Mrs. Hayes, the car is ready downstairs." "Thank you, Chloe," Simone replied, picking up a small leather clutch from her desk. "Cancel my afternoon meetings. I have a brief personal errand to run." The personal errand was a 3-hour drive north to the Federal Correctional Institution in Oxford, Wisconsin. The visiting room at FCI Oxford was a stark contrast to the penthouse ballrooms Richard was accustomed to. It was noisy, brightly lit by buzzing fluorescent bulbs, and smelled of industrial cleaner. When Richard was led into the room by a guard, he looked a decade older. His silver hair, once his pride, was thinning and unkempt. The khaki prison uniform hung loosely on his depleted frame. He shuffled toward the plexiglass partition, picking up the heavy black telephone receiver with trembling hands. Simone sat on the other side, a vision of absolute elegance and untouchable power. She picked up her receiver. "Simmy," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. He pressed his hand against the scratched glass. "You came." "I did, Richard," Simone said smoothly, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed, the tears flowing freely now. "Every day in here, I realize what I lost. I was a fool. I know you hate me, but please tell me you forgive me. Tell me this is enough." Simone looked at the man who had tried to convince the world she was crazy. She remembered the nights locked out in the cold. She remembered the smirks, the gaslighting, the sheer terror of doubting her own mind. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a single piece of paper. She pressed it flat against the plexiglass so he could read it. It was a copy of the original $400,000 cashier's check she had given him 7 years ago to start his company. Stamped across the front in bold red ink were the words, "A.C. Countin, set lid in full." "I don't hate you, Richard," Simone said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, icy calm. "Hate requires emotional investment. I look at you and I feel absolutely nothing. You are simply a bad debt that I have finally collected." Richard stared at the paper, his jaw trembling, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as the finality of her words sank in. Simone calmly folded the paper, placed it back into her clutch, and stood up. She smoothed the front of her emerald blazer. "Goodbye, Richard. Enjoy the rest of your sentence." She hung up the receiver. She didn't look back as she walked out of the prison, the heavy steel doors locking securely behind her, stepping out into the bright, warm sunlight of a life she had brilliantly fought to reclaim. Simone's story is a chilling and triumphant reminder. Never underestimate the silent observation of a brilliant woman. Richard thought he could break her down, drain her resources, and discard her while convincing the world she was losing her mind. But gaslighting only works if the victim surrenders their reality. Simone refused to surrender. She weaponized her pain, played the long game, and meticulously built a trap so airtight that her abuser didn't realize he was caught until the cell doors were already slamming shut. She didn't just survive his betrayal, she financially and legally annihilated him, reclaiming her empire and her sanity. If this story of ultimate revenge, brilliance, and karma hitting hard kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of the power of a woman pushed too far, and subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping real-life drama stories every single week.